In the sweltering August of 1999, in the dense, unforgiving wilderness of Blackwood National Forest, two young lives were erased from the world. Liam Carter, 19, and Chloe Vance, 18, had driven up in Liam's beat-up Ford Bronco, their hearts full of the foolish, beautiful invincibility of youth. They were bright students, sweethearts since high school, with plans to conquer the world after one last summer of freedom. They pitched their tent near Serpent's Creek, a place known for its treacherous beauty and sudden, violent weather. They were last seen by a park ranger making his rounds, who noted their cheerful waves and the small, crackling campfire they'd just started. When they failed to check out 3 days later, a search was launched. For weeks, the forest was alive with the sounds of helicopters, shouting search parties, and the mournful bays of tracking dogs. They found the campsite first. The tent was still pitched, but inside, their sleeping bags were neatly rolled. Their cooler held a few remaining drinks, and a half-eaten bag of marshmallows sat on a log. The fire was a cold, gray circle of ash. The only thing missing was Liam's Bronco. The initial theory was simple and tragic. They had decided to leave early, perhaps due to an unseen emergency, and had driven off a winding mountain road. But dragging the nearby creeks and ravines yielded nothing. The Bronco was never found. As weeks turned into months, other theories emerged, each more painful for the families clinging to hope. Had they been attacked by a wild animal? Unlikely, the experts said. The campsite was too clean. Had they met with foul play? Possible. But there were no signs of a struggle, no witnesses, no ransom notes. The most popular theory, the one that settled into the public consciousness like a layer of dust, was that they had simply run away. They were young, in love, perhaps wanting to escape the futures that had been mapped out for them. It was a narrative of romantic escapism, one that offered a sliver of hope that they were alive, somewhere, starting a new life. The investigation eventually went cold, the case file relegated to a dusty shelf, a testament to a mystery the forest refused to solve. The families grieved, the community moved on, and the names Liam Carter and Chloe Vance became a local ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered to new generations of campers. But 20 years later, in the spring of 2019, Progress, in its relentless, earth-moving fashion, began to unearth the forest's long-held secrets. A generous donation from local philanthropist and construction magnate Marcus Thorne had funded the development of the new Blackwood Community Outreach Center, a sprawling complex built on a plot of land that bordered the national forest, land that had been privately owned and unused for decades. A crew from Thorne Construction was on site, the air thick with the smell of diesel and fresh-cut pine. They were pouring the concrete foundation for the main building. A man named Dave, a seasoned concrete finisher with a face weathered by sun and cynicism, was guiding the chute of a cement mixer, the thick, gray slurry flooding into the rebar-enforced wooden forms. It was a routine job, monotonous and loud. But as the gray tide rose, something caught his eye. Something unnatural. A patch of color, a flash of faded blue, being submerged by the concrete. He yelled over the roar of the engine, signaling the driver to stop the pour. His foreman, a thick-set man named Jerry, stomped over, annoyance etched on his face. "What is it, Dave? We're losing light." Dave didn't answer. He grabbed a nearby spade and carefully, hesitantly, began to push back the heavy, wet concrete. The blue color emerged again. It was fabric, denim, to be exact. As he scraped away more of the slurry, the shape became horrifyingly clear. It was a human leg, clad in a pair of weathered jeans. A collective gasp went through the crew. Work stopped. The roar of the mixer died, replaced by an unnerving, profound silence, broken only by the chirping of birds in the nearby trees. Jerry fumbled for his phone, his hand shaking. Within the hour, the construction site was a crime scene, bathed in the flashing red and blue of police cruisers. The concrete, a symbol of new beginnings, had become a tomb. And as forensic teams began the delicate, painstaking process of chipping away at the partially set gray stone, they uncovered not one, but two skeletons, locked together in a macabre embrace. Tucked beneath one of the skeletons, preserved in the oxygen-deprived seal of the earth, was a battered leather wallet. Inside, a faded laminated driver's license showed the smiling, hopeful face of a 19-year-old boy named Liam Carter. The forest had finally given up its dead. The ghost story had just become terrifyingly real. Detective Miles Corbin stood under the harsh glare of the forensic tent, the air thick with the metallic scent of blood and the earthy smell of disturbed soil. The hum of the portable generator was a low, angry thrum against the quiet reverence of the scene. He was 52 now, his face a roadmap of long nights and difficult cases, his eyes holding a weariness that went deeper than simple fatigue. He had been a rookie just a year on the force when Liam and Chloe had vanished. He remembered the posters, the tearful press conferences, the creeping sense of failure that had permeated the department as the trail went cold. The case had become a part of his professional DNA, a foundational failure that had shaped the kind of detective he became, relentless, methodical, and deeply skeptical of easy answers. He looked down at the two shallow graves, now meticulously excavated. The skeletons, stained brown by the soil, were laid out with an almost artistic precision by the forensic anthropologists. Beside them, on a sterile blue tarp, were the artifacts of their last moments. Faded scraps of clothing, a single hiking boot, and the wallet that had broken the case wide open. Dr. Anya Sharma, the county's chief medical examiner, knelt beside him, her expression grim. "They weren't just buried, Miles," she said, her voice low. "Their positioning is unnatural. And look at this." She pointed to Liam's skeleton, specifically the hyoid bone in the neck. A clean fracture. Textbook strangulation. Both of them. Corbin's jaw tightened. The popular narrative, the romantic notion of two lovers running away, evaporated in the sterile, scientific air of the tent. This was no accident. This was no escape. This was murder. Cold, brutal, and calculated. "What else?" he asked, his voice a low growl. "We found something else," Anya said, standing up and leading him to a stainless steel evidence tray. It was under the remains of the girl, Chloe. It was protected by the way she was lying. On the tray, cleaned and tagged, sat a small, tarnished object. It was a Zippo lighter, the cheap, ubiquitous kind sold at gas stations. But this one was different. Etched onto its side was a peculiar, specific logo. A stylized eagle clutching a gear, the insignia of the now-defunct Blackwood automotive plant, which had closed down in the early 90s. "Interesting," Corbin muttered, leaning in closer. "But not exactly a smoking gun. Half the town probably worked there at some point." "Maybe," Anya conceded. "But there's something else. We found traces of a specific industrial accelerant on their clothes, what's left of them. Something potent. Not the kind of thing you'd take on a camping trip." The pieces were starting to form a picture, but it was fractured, incoherent. A car factory lighter. Industrial chemicals. Two teenagers strangled and buried on a piece of land that had sat vacant for 2 decades. It didn't fit the profile of a random crime of opportunity in a national forest. This felt planned, organized. The discovery of the bodies had sent a shockwave through the small community of Northwood. The story was on every local news channel. The old photos of Liam and Chloe, smiling, vibrant, frozen in 1999, displayed next to the grim images of the excavation site. For the Carters and the Van Cess, it was the reopening of a wound that had never truly healed, a new and more terrible kind of grief that replaced the agonizing uncertainty of the past 20 years. Corbin felt the weight of their resurrected pain as a physical pressure in his chest. He had a duty not just to the dead, but to the living who had been left behind. His first official act was to pull the original case file. It was thick with faded reports, witness statements that led nowhere, and maps of search grids that had turned up nothing. He read through the initial detective's notes, a man named Henderson who was now long retired. Henderson had been convinced they'd driven off a cliff. He'd fixated on the missing Bronco, seeing it as the key to the whole affair. The report detailed the extensive and ultimately fruitless search for the vehicle. But now, Corbin knew Henderson had been looking in the wrong place. The kids never drove away. They were murdered right here on this land, and their killer had been so confident, so certain of his power, that he had left them in a shallow grave, convinced they would never be found. Corbin's gaze drifted from the evidence tray to the half-finished structure of the community center looming in the distance, its steel skeleton stark against the evening sky. A monument to civic pride, funded by the town's most celebrated benefactor, Marcus Thorne. The land had belonged to Thorne for years, part of a larger portfolio he'd acquired for development. Corbin's mind began to churn. Why this spot? Why bury them here, on private land, instead of deeper in the national forest, where they would almost certainly never be found? It was either incredibly stupid or incredibly arrogant. And the kind of person who could strangle two teenagers and walk away without a trace for 20 years was rarely stupid. It was an act of dominance. A statement. This is my land. I can do whatever I want here. The anomaly, the out-of-place clue, was the Zippo lighter. It felt like a loose thread, and Corbin knew from long experience that if you pulled on a thread like that, sometimes the entire tapestry of a carefully constructed lie begins to unravel. The investigation was no longer about finding Liam and Chloe. It was about finding the monster who had taken them. And that monster, Corbin suspected, had been hiding in plain sight for a very, very long time. The next morning, the incident room was a hive of controlled chaos. Whiteboards were covered in a spiderweb of names, dates, and locations. A large map of the Blackwood area dominated one wall, a red pin marking the discovery site. Detective Miles Corbin stood at the head of the long table, a mug of black coffee steaming in his hand. His team, a mix of seasoned veterans and younger, tech-savvy detectives, looked at him with focused intensity. "All right," Corbin began, his voice cutting through the low hum of conversation. "Let's be clear. Everything we thought we knew about the Carter Vance disappearance is wrong. This wasn't a runaway case. It wasn't an accident. This was a double homicide." He gestured to the board. The ME-as-confirmed cause of death for both victims was manual strangulation. They were buried in a shallow grave on what was then undeveloped private property. They were found yesterday during a concrete pour for the new Thorne Community Center. The timeline is our first problem. They were last seen by a park ranger on the evening of August 14, 1999. Their bodies were found approximately 2 miles from their campsite. The question is, what happened between the campsite and the grave? A young detective, Harris, raised his hand. "Sir, the original file was obsessed with the missing vehicle. Liam Carter's 1992 Ford Bronco. It was never recovered. If they were killed there, what happened to it?" "Exactly," Corbin said, pointing at Harris with his mug. "The killer didn't just have to dispose of 2 bodies. He had to dispose of a 2-ton vehicle. That's not easy. It suggests a certain level of resources. A place to crush it, bury it, or sink it. We need to start a new search, but not in the ravines. We need to look at scrapyards, old industrial sites, private quarries. Anywhere you could make a truck disappear in 1999. He then projected a photo of the tarnished Zippo lighter onto the screen. This was found with Chloe Vance's remains. The logo is for the old Blackwood automotive plant. It closed in '93, but a lot of people in this town work there. We're going to pull the employee records. It's a long shot, but it's the only unique piece of physical evidence we have that isn't directly tied to the victims." The rest of the briefing was a flurry of assignments, cross-referencing old witness statements, running background checks on individuals mentioned in the original file, and, most importantly, delving into the history of the land itself. After the meeting, Corbin knew what he had to do next. It was the part of the job he dreaded most. He drove his unmarked sedan through the quiet, tree-lined streets of Northwood, the town still reeling from the news. He pulled up to a modest, well-kept house with a garden in the front. This was the Carter residence. He took a deep breath before knocking. The door was opened by a man who looked 10 years older than his 60-odd years, his face etched with a familiar, hollowed-out grief. It was John Carter, Liam's father. "Detective," he said, his voice raspy. "We were told you'd be coming." Corbin was led into a living room that was a shrine to a life cut short. Photos of Liam were everywhere. As a gap-toothed kid on a bicycle, a proud high school graduate in a cap and gown, and one with a beaming Chloe, their arms around each other. Helen Carter, Liam's mother, sat on the sofa, clutching a framed picture. Her eyes were red-rimmed but clear, her gaze fixed on Corbin with a desperate intensity. "For 20 years," she began, her voice trembling but firm, "we let ourselves believe they might be out there. That one day, the phone would ring. It was a foolish hope, wasn't it? But it was all we had." "There's nothing foolish about hope, Mrs. Carter," Corbin said gently. "What happened to your son, to both of them, was an evil act. My only promise to you is that I will do everything in my power to find the person responsible." He spent over an hour with them, asking the same questions they had answered 2 decades ago, hoping that the passage of time might have shaken loose a forgotten detail. He asked about Liam's friends, his habits, any arguments or strange encounters in the weeks leading up to the camping trip. They told him about Liam's passion for photography, his dream of becoming a photojournalist. They spoke of Chloe's love for botany, her plans to study environmental science. They were good kids. They had no enemies. As he was leaving, John Carter stopped him at the door. The detective back then, Henderson, he was sure they'd run off in the Bronco. He kept asking if Liam was in some kind of trouble, if he had debts. He made it sound like our son was a criminal. Henderson was wrong, Corbin said, meeting his gaze. Your son was a victim, and so was Chloe. His next visit was to the Vance family home, where he found a similar scene of quiet, dignified sorrow. Chloe's parents were more withdrawn, the shock having rendered them almost silent. It was her older sister, Sarah, who did most of the talking. Sarah was a lawyer now, her grief sharpened by an analytical edge. "We never believed they ran away," Sarah said, her voice tight with suppressed anger. "Chloe called me the day before they left. She was excited. She was talking about what classes she was going to take in the fall. She wasn't running from anything. She was running toward everything." Corbin asked her the same questions. "Any enemies? Any strange occurrences?" Sarah paused, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "There was one thing," she said slowly. "A few weeks before the trip, Chloe mentioned that Liam was working on a photo project. Something for himself, not for school. He said he was documenting the town's forgotten places. Old factories, abandoned buildings. She thought it was a little morbid, but he was passionate about it. He said he'd found something interesting, but he wouldn't tell her what it was. He wanted to surprise her." "Did he say where he was taking these photos?" Corbin asked, his senses suddenly on high alert. She didn't know, Sarah admitted. But he spent a lot of time near the old industrial park on the edge of the forest, the same area where they're building that new center. The connection clicked in Corbin's mind like the tumblers of a lock. A photo project, forgotten places, the old industrial park, the very land where they were found. Liam hadn't just been camping. He had been investigating something. He had stumbled onto a secret, and that secret had gotten him and the girl he loved killed. The missing Bronco wasn't the key. The key was a roll of undeveloped film that had likely been destroyed 20 years ago. Corbin now had a motive, a ghost of one at least. This wasn't a random killing. It was a silencing. The next day, Corbin's investigation led him to the gleaming glass and steel headquarters of Thorne Industries. The building was a monument to new money and civic influence, a stark contrast to the old, gritty Northwood that Liam Carter had been trying to document. Corbin had requested a meeting with Marcus Thorne, the man whose generosity was inadvertently responsible for reopening the coldest case in the county's history. He was escorted by a pristine suited assistant into a sprawling corner office with a panoramic view of the town and the dark green expanse of the Blackwood Forest beyond. Marcus Thorne rose from behind a massive mahogany desk to greet him. He was in his late 60s, with a full head of silver hair, a warm, charismatic smile, and the easy confidence of a man accustomed to power. He was wearing a tailored suit, but his sleeves were rolled up, an affectation meant to convey a man-of-the-people work ethic. "Detective Corbin," he said, his handshake firm. "A terrible business. Just terrible. When my foreman called me, I couldn't believe it. On our site. After all these years. Those poor children." His concern seemed genuine. his voice laced with the appropriate amount of civic sorrow. "I wanted to assure you," Thorne continued, gesturing for Corbin to sit, "that you and your department will have my full and complete cooperation. My company, my records, my people, anything you need is at your disposal. We want to see justice done." "We appreciate that, Mr. Thorne," Corbin said, his expression unreadable. He took out his notebook. "I have a few questions about the land itself. Our records show you purchased that parcel in 1997 through a subsidiary, Northwood Land Development." "That's correct," Thorne said smoothly. "It was part of a larger acquisition. We saw potential for future community growth. For years, it just sat there. The outreach center seemed like the perfect use for it. A way of giving back. In 1999, was the property fenced off? Was it patrolled?" Corbin asked. "Fenced? Loosely, perhaps. But it was a large, wooded area bordering a national forest. Kids used to cut through there all the time. It was impossible to keep it completely secure. As for patrols, no. There was no reason to. It was just an empty plot of land." Thorne leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Detective, is there something about the property that you find significant?" "We believe the victims were killed there," Corbin said, watching Thorne's reaction closely. "It wasn't a body dump site. It was the primary crime scene." Thorne's eyes widened slightly, a masterful performance of shock. "My God, that's horrifying. To think something so evil happened right there, and no one knew for 2 decades. Corbin felt a prickle of instinct, a familiar sensation that told him he was being played. Thorne's responses were too polished, his emotions too perfectly calibrated. He decided to probe a little. "The lighter we found, the one from the old auto plant. Did you ever work there, Mr. Thorne?" Thorne chuckled, a disarming, folksy sound. "Lord, no. I was already starting my first construction business when that place was in its heyday. My father did, though. Put in 30 years on the line. Most of the men in this town from that generation did. A lighter like that could have belonged to anyone." It was a plausible, easy deflection. Corbin knew he wouldn't get anything more from Thorne directly. He was too smart, too insulated. The visit, however, wasn't fruitless. It confirmed Corbin's gut feeling. Thorne was hiding something behind his mask of philanthropy. As Corbin left the building, he made a call to Detective Harris back at the precinct. "Harris, I want you to start a deep dive. Not on Thorne, but on Northwood Land Development. I want to see every transaction, every permit, every piece of correspondence since its inception. I also want a list of all its corporate officers and silent partners, and cross-reference that with the employee list from the Blackwood Automotive Plant. Let's see if there's any overlap." His next stop was a small, cluttered house on the other side of town, the home of retired Detective Frank Henderson. Corbin found him in his backyard, tending to a sad-looking vegetable garden. Henderson was in his 70s, a man shrunken by age and regret. His memory of the Carter Vance case was soured by his own conviction that he had been right. "It was the Bronco," Henderson said, wiping dirt from his hands onto his trousers. "I told them then, and I'll tell you now. Find the truck, you find the kids. They probably drove it into a lake up in the mountains, high on something, and the cold water preserved them. You guys just didn't look hard enough." "They weren't in a lake, Frank," Corbin said flatly. "They were strangled and buried 2 miles from their campsite." Henderson stared at him, his cantankerous certainty faltering. "Strangled? Are you sure?" "The me is sure," Corbin replied. "I read your file. You were fixated on them being runaways or dying by accident. Why didn't you pursue the foul play angle more aggressively?" Henderson sighed, slumping onto a plastic patio chair. He suddenly looked old and tired. "Pressure Miles. The families were a wreck, the media was all over us, and there was nothing. No witnesses, no struggle. The runaway theory was clean. It gave people, even the parents, a weird kind of hope. And my captain wanted it closed. We had no leads. What was I supposed to do? Chase ghosts." "Did you ever look at the owner of the land next to the park?" Corbin pressed. "The land where we just found them." "Some development company," Henderson shrugged. "Why would I? The crime, as we saw it, happened in the park or on the road. The private land was just background. Corbin's frustration mounted. Henderson hadn't been incompetent, just unimaginative. He'd followed the most obvious path, and in doing so, had walked right past the truth. As he drove away from Henderson's house, Corbin's mind replayed the interview with Chloe's sister. Liam's photo project. The town's forgotten places. He was documenting something. What if he had photographed something he shouldn't have? Something happening on that empty plot of land, owned by Marcus Thorne's company? It was a long shot, a theory built on a whisper of a memory. But it was more than Henderson ever had. It was a path that led away from the forest and towards the town's most powerful man. And Corbin was determined to follow it, no matter where it led. The forensics lab was a sterile world of white coats and humming machines, a place where the dead offered up their final, silent testimonies. Dr. Anya Sharma led Detective Corbin to a high-resolution monitor, displaying a magnified image of a bone fragment. "We got more from the soil samples around the gravesite," she said, her tone clinical, but with an undercurrent of excitement. "The industrial accelerant I mentioned? We've identified it. It's a specific chemical solvent, TC1. Highly toxic, highly controlled. It was primarily used in the automotive industry for degreasing engine parts before painting." Corbin stared at the screen, the pieces clicking into place. "The Blackwood Automotive Plant." "Exactly," Anya confirmed. "But here's the kicker. The plant closed in '93. Liam and Chloe disappeared in '99. TC1 was heavily regulated by the EPA by then. It wasn't something you could just buy at a hardware store. Whoever had access to it in 1999 likely had a stockpile of it from the old plant." The Zippo lighter was no longer just a random artifact. It was a direct link to a place, and now to a specific chemical. The killer wasn't just a former employee. They were someone with continued access to the plant's resources, even years after it had shut down. "What was the solvent for, Anya?" Corbin asked. "On their clothes." "Our best guess? It was used to destroy evidence," she replied. "Perhaps to clean a surface, or to try and degrade their clothing or other items. But it's potent stuff. Traces of it soaked into the soil and their clothes, and it never fully dissipated." Corbin's mind raced. A killer with access to an abandoned factory and its hazardous materials. A killer who needed to make a 2-ton Ford Bronco disappear. It painted a portrait of someone with industrial-level resources. Someone like a construction magnate. He returned to the precinct, the chemical name TC1 burning in his mind. He found Detective Harris hunched over his computer, his face illuminated by the glow of the screen. "Got something for me, Harris?" "Maybe," Harris said, not looking up. "I did the deep dive on Northwood Land Development, the shell company Thorne used to buy the land. It's clean on the surface. But when I cross-referenced the corporate officers from '97 with the employee manifest from the auto plant, I got a hit." He turned to face Corbin, his expression triumphant. The vice president of the shell company, a man named Gerald Fincher. He was the former plant manager at Blackwood Automotive right up until it closed. "Fincher," Corbin repeated, the name unfamiliar. "Run him." Harris's fingers flew across the keyboard. A record appeared on the screen. Gerald Fincher, deceased. He died in 2005, Harris reported. Massive heart attack. Lived a quiet life after the plant closed. No criminal record. It was another dead end, but a significant one. It placed a high-ranking official from the defunct plant inside Marcus Thorne's inner circle during the exact time frame of the murders. Thorne had lied. He hadn't just been some unconnected businessman. His company's VP was the former manager of the very plant tied to the evidence. "All right," Corbin said, his intuition buzzing. "Let's pivot. Liam Carter's photo project. The town's forgotten places." He was snooping around the old industrial park. Let's assume he photographed something on Thorne's property. What could have been there in 1999 that was worth killing 2 people to protect? "The land was officially vacant, sir," Harris said. "No permits for construction, no storage licenses." "Officially," Corbin stressed. What if it was being used for something unofficial? Something illicit? a place to store or dispose of things. The image of the missing Bronco flashed in his mind. The industrial solvent. The abandoned factory. Harris, pull up satellite imagery of that parcel. Go back as far as you can. Let's see what that empty plot of land really looked like. While Harris worked on the satellite data, Corbin took the Zippo lighter out of its evidence bag and placed it on his desk. He stared at the etched logo, the eagle and the gear. It felt like a taunt, a piece of the killer's identity, left behind in a moment of arrogance or carelessness. He thought about Marcus Thorne, his polished charm, his feigned concern. The man had built an empire, positioning himself as the savior of a town still wounded from the loss of its main industry. He donated to charities, funded community centers, and shook all the right hands. It was the perfect cover. Who would ever suspect the town's benefactor of being a monster? Corbin's phone rang. It was Sarah Vance, Chloe's sister. "Detective," she said, her voice strained. "I was going through some of my parents' old things, boxes from Chloe's room they could never bring themselves to open. I found something. It might be nothing, but after we spoke I thought." "What is it, Sarah?" Corbin asked, leaning forward. "It's a map," she said. "A hand-drawn map of the Blackwood trails. It's from Liam. He gave it to Chloe. He marked their campsite, but he also circled another area. An area on the edge of the park with a note next to it." Corbin held his breath. "What does the note say?" "It says," Sarah replied, her voice cracking with emotion, "the graveyard. Bring the flash." The line went silent for a moment, the word hanging in the air between them. The graveyard. Not a real cemetery, but a name Liam had given to a place. A place he found interesting. A place he wanted to show the girl he loved. A place where forgotten things went to die. "Sarah, where on the map is this circle?" Corbin asked urgently. "It's on the eastern border of the park," she said. "Right where the news said they're building that new center." The final piece of the puzzle slid into place, not with a click, but with a sickening thud. Liam hadn't just stumbled upon something. He'd found it, named it, and mapped it. He found a place where things were being buried. He likely thought he'd found a secret illegal dumping ground for old cars or industrial waste. A great subject for his photo project. But what he had actually found was far more sinister. It wasn't a graveyard for cars. It was a graveyard for people. Corbin felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. Liam and Chloe hadn't been killed because they saw something. They were killed because of what Liam had found and what he had documented. The photo project was no longer a tangential detail. It was the heart of the entire case. The graveyard. The name was a chilling premonition. He had to assume the killer had found and destroyed Liam's camera and film. But the map, tucked away in a box in Chloe's childhood bedroom, was an echo of that discovery, a ghost map leading back to the scene of the crime. He now had a direct link between Liam's investigation and the specific plot of land owned by Marcus Thorne. He stared at the white boards in the incident room, the threads now weaving a coherent, terrifying narrative. Marcus Thorne, a man of immense power and influence. Gerald Fincher, his right-hand man and the former manager of a shuttered auto plant. A stockpile of industrial solvents. A piece of land used as a secret burial ground. It was a conspiracy, hidden for 2 decades beneath a veneer of philanthropy and civic duty. But Corbin's theory, as compelling as it was still built on circumstantial evidence and intuition. He had nothing that would stand up in court against a man with Thorne's resources. He needed something more, something concrete. "Harris," Corbin barked, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "The satellite imagery. Did you find anything?" Harris spun around, his eyes wide. "Sir, you need to see this." He projected an archived satellite photo from June 1999 onto the main screen. The image was grainy, black and white, but the details were discernible. It showed the parcel of land in question. Most of it was dense woods, but in one corner, near where the bodies were eventually found, there was a clearing. And in that clearing, the satellite had captured a clear image of ground disturbance. Long, straight lines had been dug into the earth. Trenches. It looks like they were burying pipes or cables, Harris said. But there were no permits for any kind of utility work on that land at that time. They weren't burying pipes, Corbin said grimly, walking closer to the screen. Look at the scale. Those trenches are huge, deep and wide. He pointed to a small, dark shape near one of the trenches. What's that? Harris zoomed in, the pixels blurring before sharpening. The shape was rectangular. It was a vehicle, a boxy, mid-sized SUV. It's consistent with the dimensions of a 1992 Ford Bronco, Harris said, his voice barely a whisper. And look, Corbin said, his finger tracing a path on the screen. That trench, it's filled in on the next satellite pass in September. The Bronco is gone. The ground is smoothed over. They buried the evidence. There it was. Photographic proof. The missing Bronco, right next to a massive, freshly dug trench on Marcus Thorne's land, just weeks before Liam and Chloe were murdered. They hadn't stumbled onto a graveyard that was already there. They had stumbled upon its creation. They had likely photographed the entire operation. This revelation changed the scope of the investigation entirely. The trenches weren't just for one or two bodies. They were for something much bigger. Corbin's mind flashed back to the old, unsolved missing persons cases from the surrounding counties. The lonely hikers, the stranded motorists, the drifters who had vanished without a trace over the years. Had Thorne been running a clandestine disposal service? Was his land a final resting place for the victims of other crimes? Perhaps for a price? The thought was staggering. Marcus Thorne wasn't just a killer. He was an undertaker for the criminal underworld. His philanthropic projects, his community centers, were built on a foundation of bones. Corbin knew he was getting dangerously close. He also knew that a man like Thorne, who had maintained this secret for so long, would have layers of protection. Poking this hornet's nest would bring the hornets out. He felt a surge of adrenaline, the thrill of the hunt mixed with a cold dose of fear. He was no longer just solving a 20-year-old murder. He was dismantling a hidden empire. He needed more than satellite photos. He needed a human source. Someone from the inside who knew what Thorne was capable of. Someone who had been there. His gaze fell on the name on the whiteboard. Gerald Fincher, the deceased plant manager and Thorne's VP. A dead end. But Fincher must have had a family. He must have had employees. Someone, somewhere knew something. Harris, Corbin commanded, his voice steely with resolve. Find out everything you can about Gerald Fincher. I want to know who his friends were, who he worked with after the plant closed. I'm looking for someone who was loyal to him. Someone who might have been involved in whatever they were doing out there on that land. And I'm looking for someone who might have had a falling out. Someone with a conscience, however buried it might be. The hunt for a ghost had begun. Corbin was looking for a witness who was either scared, complicit, or dead. It was a desperate move, a shot in the dark, but it was the only one he had left. He had to find a crack in the wall of silence that Marcus Thorne had built around himself, or this case, and all the secrets buried with it, would be lost forever. The investigation into Gerald Fincher's life became a painstaking archaeological dig through public records and faded memories. Fincher had been a company man, quiet and efficient. After the auto plant closed, he'd seamlessly transitioned to working for Thorne, a move that few had questioned at the time. He was a widower with no children, a man who had left behind few personal ripples. Most of his former colleagues from the plant were either dead or had moved away. The trail was growing cold, and Corbin could feel a familiar pressure beginning to build from his superiors. Captain Davies, a man who played golf with Marcus Thorne at the local country club, had called him twice, his inquiries couched in the language of bureaucratic concern. Are we sure we're on the right track here, Miles? Marcus is a pillar of this community. We need to be on solid ground before we start casting aspersions. Corbin knew what that meant. Back off. You're aiming too high. It was the classic small-town power dynamic, the unspoken rule, that some men were simply too important to be guilty. This resistance only hardened Corbin's resolve. His intuition, honed by decades of seeing through lies, screamed that Thorne was the one. He decided to focus on the low-level employees, the ones who would have been doing the actual digging and driving. He cross-referenced Fincher's known associates with payroll records from Thorne Construction in 1999. He was looking for a name that appeared in both worlds. After 2 days of staring at spreadsheets, Harris found him. A man named Arthur Prentice. Prentice had worked as a foreman at the auto plant under Fincher. After being laid off, he was immediately hired by Thorne Construction as a site logistics coordinator, a vague title for a man who operated heavy machinery. He'd worked for Thorne for 5 years before abruptly quitting in 2004, a year before Fincher's death. His termination record simply said resigned, personal reasons. According to his last known address, he was living in a rundown trailer park on the outskirts of the next county over. "This is our guy," Corbin said, looking at the man's grainy DMV photo. Prentice had the weary, haunted eyes of someone who had seen too much. He was there, Harris. He was Fincher's man on the ground. He drove the excavators. Corbin drove out to the trailer park alone. He didn't want to spook Prentice with a uniform or a marked car. The park was a sad, neglected place, a collection of rusting metal homes sinking slowly into the mud. He found Arthur Prentice sitting on the warped wooden steps of his trailer, nursing a bottle of cheap whiskey, though it was barely noon. He was a shell of the man in the photo, gaunt and frail, with a persistent, hacking cough. "Arthur Prentice?" Corbin asked, keeping his distance. Prentice looked up, his eyes clouded with suspicion and alcohol. "Who's asking?" "Detective Miles Corbin, Northwood PD," Corbin said, holding up his badge. "I want to talk to you about a job you had a long time ago, with Thorne Construction." The man's reaction was instantaneous and profound. The blood drained from his face, and his hand, holding the bottle, began to tremble violently. "I don't know anything," he rasped, his voice rough from disuse and cheap cigarettes. "That was a lifetime ago. I don't remember." "I think you do remember, Arthur," Corbin said, his tone patient but firm. "I think you remember 1999. I think you remember digging trenches on a plot of land by the Blackwood Forest. I think you remember a Ford Bronco." Prentice flinched as if struck. He tried to stand, to retreat into his trailer, but his legs wouldn't hold him. He sank back onto the steps, his head in his hands. "They told me it was just disposal," he whispered, the words choked with a 20-year-old fear. "Industrial waste from the old plant. Fincher said Thorne was doing the county a favor, getting rid of it on the quiet, so they wouldn't have to pay the EPA fees. He paid us cash. A lot of it." Corbin sat down on a cinder block opposite him. "And the Bronco, Arthur? Was that industrial waste too?" Tears began to stream down Prentice's weathered face, carving clean tracks through the grime. "We didn't know about the kids," he sobbed. "I swear to God we didn't know. One day, Fincher just tells me there's a truck that needs to disappear. He said some joyriders had abandoned it on the property. We put it in the hole and buried it. That was the job. Don't ask questions." "But you did ask, didn't you, Arthur?" Corbin pressed gently. "That's why you quit." Prentice nodded, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "A few years later, Fincher got sloppy. We were burying something else, another package, and he was drunk. He started talking, mumbling about how Thorne was providing a valuable service, how he took care of problems. He mentioned the campers, said they'd been snooping around, taking pictures, said they got what they deserved for sticking their noses where they didn't belong." The confession, second-hand but potent, hung in the stale air. It was the confirmation Corbin needed. Thorne hadn't just used the land to get rid of a truck. He was a contract killer, a cleaner, using his construction equipment to erase people from existence. Liam and Chloe were not his client's victims. They were his own, killed to protect his horrific side business. "Why didn't you come forward, Arthur?" Corbin asked, the question devoid of judgment. Prentice let out a bitter, self-hating laugh. "And say what? To who? Thorne owns everyone. The cops, the judges. You think a dirtbag like me could touch a man like him? Fincher told me what would happen if I ever talked. He said Thorne had a trench with my name on it. I ran. I just ran and never looked back. Fincher is dead, Arthur. You're safe now." You don't get it, Prentice said, looking Corbin directly in the eye, his gaze suddenly sharp and sober. Thorne is the devil, and you don't just walk away from a deal with the devil. Prentice agreed to give a formal statement. It was a breakthrough, the first real crack in Thorne's armor. As Corbin drove back to Northwood, he felt a grim sense of purpose. He had the witness. He had the satellite photos. He had the motive. He was ready to face the devil. But he knew Prentice was right. A man like Thorne wouldn't be taken easily. He wouldn't have operated for this long without contingency plans, without a final, violent line of defense. The part of the investigation that involved digging up the past was over. The next part would be far more dangerous. Armed with Arthur Prentice's sworn statement, Detective Corbin finally had the leverage he needed. He bypassed his own captain and went directly to the district attorney, laying out the entire investigation. The forensics, the satellite images, Liam's graveyard map, and now, the explosive testimony of a first-hand witness. The DA, a cautious but principled woman named Eleanor Vance, no relation to the victim, saw the truth in the meticulously assembled evidence. She gave Corbin the go-ahead he'd been waiting for, a warrant to search Marcus Thorne's primary residence and his corporate headquarters. It was a high-stakes gamble. If they found nothing, the political fallout would be immense, and Thorne would walk away more untouchable than ever. Corbin knew the chances of finding a 20-year-old murder weapon or a bloodstained shirt were zero. Thorne was too meticulous for that. What he was hoping to find was something else, a record, a ledger, a trophy. Psychopaths like Thorne often kept souvenirs of their conquests, subtle reminders of their power that they could admire in private. He also wanted to rattle Thorne's cage, to show him that the walls were closing in, to force him into making a mistake. The raid was executed simultaneously at dawn. While one team hit the Thorne Industries building, Corbin led a small hand-picked unit to Thorne's sprawling estate on the edge of town. The house was a modern fortress of stone and glass, set back from the road behind a formidable gate. It was designed to project power and repel intrusion. They breached the gate and swept up the long, winding driveway. Corbin was the first one at the heavy oak door. He didn't bother knocking. His team used a battering ram, and the door splintered open with a deafening crack. They found Marcus Thorne in his study. He wasn't surprised or panicked. He was sitting in a leather armchair, a glass of what looked like scotch in his hand, as if he had been expecting them. He was dressed impeccably in a silk robe. The mask of the friendly philanthropist was gone, replaced by an expression of cold, reptilian calm. "Well, Detective Corbin," Thorne said, his voice smooth as polished stone, "to what do I owe this rather dramatic intrusion?" "Marcus Thorne, we have a warrant to search the premises in connection with the murders of Liam Carter and Chloe Vance," Corbin announced, his voice flat and professional. Thorne smirked, a slight, condescending curl of his lips. "The campers? A tragedy, to be sure. But what could that possibly have to do with me?" While his team began the systematic search of the massive house, Corbin stayed in the study with Thorne. He wanted to watch him, to gauge his reactions. The study was a reflection of the man, opulent, controlled, and utterly devoid of personal warmth. The walls were lined with books that looked like they had never been read and expensive, abstract art that conveyed no emotion. Corbin's eyes scanned the room, looking for the anomaly, the out-of-place object. And then he saw it. On a shelf nestled between a collection of antique globes was a row of meticulously displayed Zippo lighters. There were at least a dozen of them, each on its own small, velvet stand. "Quite the collection," Corbin remarked, walking slowly toward the shelf. "A little hobby of mine," Thorne said dismissively. "Reminders of past ventures. Each one represents a closed deal, a conquered challenge." Corbin's gaze moved along the row. A lighter from a defunct shipping company. One from a failed tech startup. And then, at the very end of the row, he saw it. A Zippo, identical to the one they'd found in the grave. It bore the same etched logo, the eagle and the gear of the Blackwood automotive plant. But this one was pristine, polished to a high shine. "This one, too?" Corbin asked, pointing to it. "A particularly challenging acquisition," Thorne said, his eyes glinting. That plant's closure was a messy affair, but profitable in the end. It was a confession, veiled in the language of business. He wasn't just talking about buying assets. He was talking about something else he had acquired from that plant. At that moment, one of Corbin's detectives, a young woman named Chun, entered the study. She was holding a clear evidence bag. "Sir," she said, her voice tense, "we found this in a safe in the master bedroom." Inside the bag was a small leather-bound ledger. Corbin took the bag, his heart pounding. He opened it carefully. The pages were filled with neat, precise handwriting. It was a list of dates, initials, and monetary figures. A record of his dark business. Near the bottom of one page, Corbin found the entry he was looking for. August 16, 1999. LC and CV N/C. LC and CV, Corbin read aloud, his voice low and dangerous. Liam Carter and Chloe Vance. What does the N/C stand for, Thorne? No charge. Thorne's smile finally faltered. He had been so arrogant, so certain of his invincibility, that he had kept a detailed log of his crimes. It was the ultimate act of hubris. They weren't a contract, Thorne said, his voice losing its polished edge, becoming something colder, more guttural. They were a nuisance. A loose end. You don't charge for taking out the trash. The admission hung in the air, thick and poisonous. It was everything. The proof, the motive, the direct link. But as Corbin looked up from a ledger, he saw that Thorne's expression had changed again. The calm was gone, replaced by a terrifying, predatory focus. "You are more clever than Henderson was, I'll give you that, detective," Thorne said, slowly rising from his chair. He was a simpleton who saw a missing truck. You saw the bigger picture. But seeing the picture and surviving it are two very different things. In one fluid motion, Thorne reached behind his desk and produced a small, silver handgun that had been hidden in a magnetic holster. The click of the safety being disengaged echoed in the silent room. "This investigation is over, detective," Thorne snarled, his face a mask of pure, remorseless evil. The hunt was over. The confrontation had begun. The air in the study crackled with a sudden, violent tension. Detective Chun instinctively drew her weapon, her sights fixed on Thorne. Corbin stood his ground, his hand hovering over his own holstered pistol, his eyes locked with the killer's. "It's over, Thorne," Corbin said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Put the gun down. There's nowhere to run." Thorne let out a dry, rasping laugh. It was a sound completely devoid of humor, like stones grinding together. "Run? Detective, men like me don't run. We erase. We eliminate. You and your witness, Prentice, you're just more loose ends." The standoff was a frozen tableau of impending violence. Thorne was cornered, his empire of secrets exposed, and like a cornered animal, he was at his most dangerous. He had nothing left to lose. Corbin knew that any sudden move could trigger a bloodbath. He needed to keep Thorne talking, to de-escalate if possible, but Thorne was beyond reason. His entire world had been built on a foundation of control and dominance, and now that it was crumbling, all that remained was the raw, psychopathic rage that had fueled him for decades. "Why Thorne?" Corbin asked, the question more for the sake of buying time than for any real need to understand the man's twisted logic. "You had everything. The money, the power, the respect. Why this? Why the killing?" Thorne's lips curled into a sneer. "You see it as killing. I see it as a service. A necessity. The world is full of messy problems, detective. I simply provide elegant, permanent solutions. The money was a means to an end. The real currency is power. The power to decide who matters and who doesn't. Those children, they didn't matter. They were an insect that flew into my web. And I did what one does with an insect." His clinical detachment was more chilling than any shouted threat. This was his confession, delivered not with remorse, but with a horrifying, matter-of-fact pride. He was a god in his own mind, dispensing life and death from his mahogany throne. "And the others?" Corbin pressed, gesturing toward the ledger in his hand. "The initials in this book? How many more are buried on your land?" "My land has been very accommodating," Thorne said with a chilling smile. "It holds its secrets well. Better than people do, it seems." He took a slight step to his left, angling himself so that a large, ornate globe stood between him and Detective Chun, partially obscuring her line of sight. It was a calculated, tactical move. Corbin saw it coming a split second before it happened. Thorne wasn't planning to surrender. He was creating an opportunity. "Drop it, Thorne," Corbin yelled, his hand finally closing on the grip of his gun. But Thorne was faster. He raised his pistol, not at Corbin, but at Chun. It was a classic, desperate gambit. Create a diversion, take out the secondary threat, and then focus on the primary. Time seemed to slow down. Corbin drew his weapon, the motions drilled into him by years of training. He saw the flash from the muzzle of Thorne's gun, heard the deafening report that echoed off the book-lined walls. He saw Chun cry out and stumble backward, clutching her shoulder. In the same instant, Corbin fired twice. The shots were precise, aimed center mass. The bullet struck Thorne in the chest, the impact throwing him backward with a force that seemed to defy his age. The silver handgun clattered onto the expensive Persian rug. Thorne collapsed against his desk, scattering papers, his eyes wide with a final, ultimate surprise. The man who had believed himself to be a master of life and death was now facing his own mortality. Corbin rushed to Chen's side. "I'm hit," she gasped, blood seeping through her fingers. "It's my shoulder. I'm okay." Paramedics were called, the house now swarming with uniformed officers. The scene was secured. Corbin stood over Thorne, who was gurgling, trying to speak, his life rapidly draining away onto the floor of his immaculate study. His reign of terror, which had lasted more than 20 years, had ended in a matter of seconds. Corbin knelt, not out of pity, but out of a grim, professional necessity. "The others, Thorne," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Where are the other graves?" Thorne looked up at him, a bloody, defiant smirk on his lips. "Go dig," he rasped, the words his last. And then his eyes went vacant. The devil was dead. The search of the estate and Thorne Industries headquarters continued for days. The ledger was a Rosetta Stone of murder, and with the information gleaned from it and from Thorne's business records, investigators began to piece together a horrifying history. Thorne had been a cleaner for hire, his services available to a select, wealthy clientele who needed problems to disappear. But his ego had been his downfall. He couldn't resist keeping a record of his power. The most crucial discovery was a detailed survey map, found in his office safe. It was a map of the graveyard property. It was marked with a grid system, and on that grid, dozens of locations were marked with dates and initials, a meticulous catalog of his victims. The property was declared a massive crime scene. Excavation began, a somber and arduous task. And just as the map indicated, they began to find them. The remains of a missing businessman from a neighboring state, a local journalist who had been investigating organized crime, a woman who had been set to testify against a powerful figure. Each discovery was a new tragedy, a new family given a terrible closure. Liam Carter and Chloe Vance had been the first victims. He'd killed himself, not for a client, but for himself, to protect the sanctity of his secret burial ground. They were the loose end that had ultimately unraveled everything. The anomaly of their innocence in a graveyard of hardened criminals and their associates was what had never sat right with Corbin, the detail his intuition had seized upon. It was the thread that, when pulled, brought the entire monstrous enterprise crashing down. The sky over Northwood was a somber, overcast gray, matching the mood of the town as it grappled with the monstrous truth about its greatest benefactor. The name Marcus Thorne, once a symbol of hope and prosperity, was now synonymous with a deep and unfathomable evil. The community center he had been building, the project that had led to his downfall, stood as a half-finished skeleton, a monument to his hypocrisy. It would eventually be torn down, the tainted ground beneath it purified. For Detective Miles Corbin, the end of the case did not bring a sense of triumph, but one of profound, weary relief. The adrenaline of the hunt had faded, leaving behind the heavy reality of the lives lost and the damage done. He had solved the puzzle, but the pieces were all tragic. The ledger in Thorne's map had officially closed a dozen other cold cases across 3 states. The scope of his evil had been staggering, a hidden cancer growing in the heart of the community for a generation. Corbin's final duty, and the one he felt most deeply, was to the families of Liam Carter and Chloe Vance. He met them together, this time not in their separate houses of grief, but in a quiet room at the station. John and Helen Carter sat beside Chloe's parents and her sister, Sarah. They were no longer just 2 families linked by a shared tragedy. They were now bound by the certainty of the truth. Corbin recounted the entire investigation, from the discovery at the construction site to the final, violent confrontation in Thorne's study. He laid out the motive. How Liam's innocent photo project had been a fatal misstep into a world they never should have known existed. He explained that their children hadn't been victims of a random act, but had been silenced to protect a vast criminal enterprise. He told them that their deaths, while tragic, had ultimately been the catalyst that exposed a monster and brought a form of justice to many other lost souls. When he finished, the room was silent for a long time. It was Helen Carter, Liam's mother, who spoke first. She looked at Corbin, her eyes filled not with the raw pain he had seen before, but with a quiet, heartbreaking gratitude. For 20 years, she said, her voice soft but steady. The worst part was not knowing. My mind created 1,000 different stories, each one more terrible than the last. But the story you told us, it's horrific, but it's finite. It has a beginning and an end. It has a villain, and it has a hero. She reached across the table and placed her hand on his. You found our boy, Detective. You brought him home. You gave him and Chloe a voice when they no longer had one. There are no words to thank you for that. John Carter nodded, his face grim, but his shoulders a little less slumped than before. You gave them justice, he said simply. Sarah Vance, the pragmatic lawyer, looked at him with an analytical eye now softened by emotion. You believed us, she said. When everyone else was content with the runaway story, you listened. You saw what others refused to see. You honored my sister's memory by finding the truth, no matter how ugly it was. Later that day, Corbin drove out to the edge of the Blackwood National Forest, not far from where it had all begun. He parked his car and walked to a lookout point that offered a sweeping view of the valley. The forest was vast and indifferent, a silent witness to the secrets it had held for so long. He thought about Liam and Chloe, 2 bright lights extinguished far too soon. Their only crime had been curiosity and a youthful belief that the world was a place to be explored. But in their tragic end, they had become something more. They were the anomaly, the innocent victims whose case had refused to stay buried. Their memory had fueled his investigation, their ghosts guiding him through the labyrinth of lies Thorne had constructed. He pulled the tarnished Zippo lighter from an evidence bag in his pocket, the one found with Chloe's remains. It was the first real clue, the small object that had felt so wrong, so out of place. It represented the killer's arrogance, a small token of a conquered challenge, carelessly left behind. He thought about the other lighter, the pristine one from Thorne's collection. 2 identical objects, one buried in the dirt with the victims, the other polished and displayed as a trophy. The duality of it all was sickening. He looked at the lighter in his hand, then out at the horizon, where the sun was finally breaking through the clouds, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The case was closed. The files would be stamped, the reports filed away. But the emotional toll would linger. The ghosts of the graveyard had been given their names back, but the scars on the community, and on himself, would remain. With a final decisive flick of his thumb, he sent the tarnished Zippo lighter spinning out over the valley, a small, silver glint tumbling end over end until it was swallowed by the immense green canopy below. He was returning it to the forest, letting go of the final piece of the case. Justice had been served, not cleanly or easily, but in the end it had been served. And for now, for Detective Miles Corbin, that had to be enough.